Live from your home of ad hoc solutions, you're listening to Techies Talking Tech Tonight, colloquially known as T4. I'm your host, Trey Comstock, and it is Wednesday, February 25th, 2015. I am joined as ever by Jimmy Principe.
Hello, Trey, and I guess the internet.
Hello. So this is the show where we as techies talk about tech at night.
It is night. Look, there's darkness.
Yeah, no, it's thoroughly dark and fantastic.
Darkness.
Darkness. So it's a chance for us to kind of talk about the technology we use, review the products we come across, rant about the things that make no darn sense.
Which is a lot of things.
All of the above. And just before we went live with the show, I informed Jimmy that I had figured out the console market, that I had a revelation, and it's
and as
genius.
ever, I think you're full of it. So continue.
Well, I figure out the console market. I think I figured out why Sony consistently wins or almost wins console generations. So the 4 generations that the Sony's been involved in now, they outright won 2 of them. PlayStation era and PlayStation 2 era by a landslide. There was no competition as to what was the primary platform in each of those eras.
There's still so many PS2s.
Right. And they actually ended up selling more PS3s than Xbox 360s. Now, that didn't happen until very late. And they had a really bad pricing strategy up front. But even still, they pulled it out. And they are currently winning this generation of consoles by a wide margin. It's not nearly like original Xbox and PS2 kind of margins, but it is definitely a wide margin. Now, the hardware's on parity enough that the problem in the PS2 era is the PS2 was significantly less powerful, but half as powerful, as the original Xbox. And so Xbox games were being hurt because they were being developed for a less powerful hardware, and then if there was any time left, they were getting up-res. This isn't actually going to hurt the Xbox One in the way that it hurt the original Xbox. Nintendo has consistently, except for the Wii as a blip, been losing the past 4 console generations. Again, by a fairly wide margin. Microsoft, again, can't seem to consistently compete with Sony. They launched first. The Xbox 360 an aberration. This is going much more like the original Xbox. Here's why I think. So I just started listening to a podcast called 8-4-Play. It's a bunch of former gaming journalists turned people who localize games from Japanese into English. They translate games so that you and I can understand them.
Which is very important.
So they do a podcast, not really about localization, but about gaming. And they've been living in Japan for a decade or more, depending on who on the team you're talking about. And so they are English-speaking American people with a very Japanese perspective on games. And they think the Xbox One is the dumbest thing on the planet. They don't get it. It's the butt of all of their jokes. Which is interesting, because here in America, it's fairly competitive. It's losing, but not by a wide margin. And it's still very much part of the conversation. They're just like, oh, it's so big and bulky. Why do you need to talk to your television? I don't like any of the games that come out on it. Because the Xbox consistently gets only really American games. Or consistently Western-made games. Obviously, its first-party games are inherently all Western-made. It's Microsoft.
They're a Seattle-based company.
They are a Seattle-based company, and they tend to own Western-based studios for their first-party content, and most of the third-party content that's coming out on it. Not exclusively, I know. But for the most part, what sets them apart is they are very focused on Western gaming. If you look at the original Xbox, it is huge and bulky and has it looks like a Western gaming PC, right? Nintendo, basically, you can only buy Japanese-made games for any Nintendo system. Nintendo is totally focused on the Japanese market. This sells in America too, but in terms of how they design and what they do, they are focused on Japan. They are a Japanese company making Japanese games that happen to play in the West. Sony does both, right? They are a Japanese company, but they own Naughty Dog, a Western developer. They get third-party content from both the Japanese developers and the Western developers. And so I think this is consistently why Sony either wins or almost wins in the console race, because they're able to reach both audiences. Nintendo, so focused on Japan. Xbox, Microsoft, so focused on the West. Sony stands in between there, gets all the Western third-party content, makes first-party Western-style games, first-party Japanese-style games, and all the Japanese third-party content. This, to me, is the differentiator.
That's an interesting point, because there have been a lot of games for Nintendo specifically, whatever their current system is at the time, where I look at it, I go, I would never play that. Well, it's because it's not targeted at me. Yeah. And even on some of the PS4 games, the JRPG stuff, like, it's more prevalent on the PS4 and the Vita than it is on the Xbox Marketplace.
Or, you look at even like Ni no Kuni, which is something I'm playing through right now on my PS3. That's one of the reasons I ended up buying a PS3, was so that I could play this, big JRPG. I can get JRPGs on my 3DS, but I can't get them on my Xbox One. I'm not going to be able to get Persona 5 on my Xbox One. I am going to have to, at some point, buy a PS4, if only
just to play Persona 5.
And also to play Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, and a few other things that will no doubt crop up. At some point, I will end up with a PS4. Whether A Thief's End this year or Persona 5 whenever it comes out is what makes me make that leap. We'll see. But at some point, I ended up with a PS3 right at the end of its life cycle, but I ended up with a PS3. So,
even though you're an Xbox guy or a Nintendo guy,
I very much kind of am an Xbox and Nintendo guy, and how I ended up is mostly how I grew up. This isn't, I actually think they both do more interesting things in terms of hardware, and I have a bias towards interesting hardware, and that's part of it. The original Xbox is crazy. Nintendo is consistently slightly wacky. At least they have a tablet controller or two screens on their handhelds or motion control that works ish. It's more that kind of stuff interests me more than here is another black slab that runs games. I am not anti-Sony, generally speaking. And Lord knows their gaming business and their insurance business are the only things making them money. On their image sensors. Yeah. I'm not anti-Sony.
All the things they're doubling down on.
Right, and I think Sony really capitalized on some of Microsoft's mistakes. But I don't think it's because Sony had an innovative plan. They certainly didn't. Their plan was make a better PS3. Make the network connection slightly better. Microsoft was like, let's swing for the fences, let's do something nuts. It may explode, and it kind of did. But for me, what I'm interested in is those swing for the fences, even if they blow up, right? I have a Sega Nomad and a Game Boy Micro. Right? I have a Game Boy Micro. This was Nintendo swinging for the fences. We're going to make a Game Boy that's like an iPod. And they did. I mean, they really, you think about how, this came out, mid-2000s or earlier than that. And, this is an incredible piece of hardware. It's beautiful. It's sleek. It's small. It really is pocket-sized. And it's it's a Game Boy Advance, so it has one of the best game libraries out there for a handheld system. No one bought it. But it's a swing for the fences. And that's what I love.
Well, it's because everyone already had an Advance.
And the DS had come out, and this was aimed at an older market, which in the West, an older market isn't interested in handhelds, generally speaking. In Japan, again, this is the kind of Japanese focus, handheld gaming is gaming. The PS4 isn't really selling in Japan right now. Neither is the Wii U, and certainly Xbox One isn't. What's selling are 3DSs. That's why you have the new 3DS. And Monster Hunter is the game, and it's out on the new 3DS. And so you sit, because people ride public transport. Everyone just about rides public transport. And so you sit there, man, woman, child, playing your 3DS, your DS, your PSP. That's why the PSP had such a long life, because it got the Monster Hunter games, and people commuting in Japan, which is a big part of Japanese life. This is another thing I kind of knew and have learned more from 8-4-Play. So you kind of see how Nintendo stays Nintendo, and why their handheld business is so important. It's not just children and guys like me in the U.S., although I did buy and do love my new 3DS with the Amiibo support.
You don't love the Amiibo support.
Turns out, Amiibos are... where do you think... Okay, I doubt you've seen this story. So, where do you think Amiibos are primarily selling? Where do you think?
Brazil.
Good answer, but no. The United States.
Really?
Yeah. The Japanese aren't buying them. We are. Which totally blew my mind, because I figured, these things must just suck here, but they're selling in Japan. No. Other way around. They're doing awesome here. Apparently, we like Toys for Life even when it's bad. Because it is, again, I like the Toys to Life category. As we talk about every week. Just not the Amiibos. Really?
Armies of mindless Amiibos.
I mean, I have my Matthew. And Matthew, my Link Amiibo. Yep. So Jimmy, what have you been doing?
I've been beating games like a boss.
You beat a game.
A game. I beat a game, and it really wasn't that long of a game to begin with.
You don't say.
Yeah. So the Order 1886 came out this past week on Friday. So I picked up my pre-order on Friday. Sat down to actually play the game. Played it a little bit on Saturday, but mostly sat down around 1:00 on Sunday. I'd beaten the game by 6:30 p.m. on Sunday. I estimate that it probably took me about 6 to 6.5 hours to beat the game.
Which is a relatively long playthrough for the Order.
Yes, and it's because I read a lot of the random little pamphlets and things. And
sure, why not? Enjoy the experience.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's short.
It's short, and that is probably it's one of its two largest faults. So let's start with the basic synopsis for people that aren't familiar with it. So the Order is set in kind of a steampunk 1886.
Steampunk Victorian London.
Yeah, steampunk Victorian London. 1886. The Knights of the Round Table still exist, and that's what the Order is.
And they protect you from the Lycans.
And they protect you from the Lycans, which
are not Moss relatives, but from the Greek root of wolf, which Lucian, so that's for werewolves.
And then they got half breeds going, and
that's what a werewolf is, a half breed, which is a Lycan. For the medical, because there's a medical term for werewolf that is like Lucianism or something, and so that's where you get Lycan. I learned a lot following way too much gaming news. Latin roots and Lycans.
Interesting. So the game is beautiful, and there's a lot of the voice acting in it's very good, and the story it's a good story. But the problem with the game, other than the fact that it's so short, is that it's really a movie.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of you watch your character
and it's in
do a bunch of stuff. Go ahead.
And it's also in a cinematic aspect ratio. So unless you have one of those ultra widescreen, ridiculous televisions or monitors, it's going to be black barred.
And you get used to it, I will say. But it does pull you in. It is a good story. But there's a lot of times where you're sitting there watching your character talk about whatever or do whatever, and you're like, I could have done that. You didn't have to have him do that. And so it felt like, in some points, I was just watching a movie. For example, the game has 15 chapters. It divides up its gameplay into chapters. I went from chapter 11 to chapter 15 very quickly because I don't think I actually had to do anything
Oh, jeez.
from chapter 11 to chapter 15. I was just watching events unfold.
Which is great, I guess, but maybe that's not gaming.
No. Yeah, it's and that's been kind of the overall opinion of the gaming press is that it's not a game, and shouldn't a game be a game and not a movie?
It is a game, right? Like, I don't.
No, yeah,
like
okay. It's not a
Gone
game.
Home's a bloody game. I mean, and this is more of a game in a traditional sense than Gone Home. But I think, like Gone Home, it is very reliant on atmospheric and QuickTime events. Unlike Gone Home, it has shooting. I mean, there is shooting, and apparently the weapons are all right.
No, the weapons are actually very interesting. And I mean, you get to play with like an arc gun, which is awesome,
And a thermite gun.
The thermite gun is really cool. But my other problem is that these guns you'd have like an instance of the gun appearing. So you'd go pick up the gun and you'd use it, and then you would never use the gun again.
That sucks.
With some exceptions. But there just were not that many places where you got to reuse guns because guess what? It's only a 6.5-hour game.
Right.
At the top end.
So one of the best arguments I heard about this game was from Jeff Gersman at Giant Bomb, and he wrote the review for the game, and he gave it like a 2 out of 5. I mean, he panned the game, and basically he disagrees with you about the story. He actually thinks the story is a little incomplete. But again, when we're debating story, the story doesn't suck.
The story doesn't suck.
Right,
the story, there is a story. It's not like a Titanfall type story. Like, right. There's a real story.
It's a real story. It's relatively compelling. The voice acting is great. Everyone's, the graphics are unbelievable.
Yeah, the graphics are beautiful.
But one of the points he makes, and I think it's somewhat what you're getting at as well, that there are video games and there are movies, and they're actually good at different things. And so maybe we should stop trying to make our games movies. We should make them video games. Right? Why would you pull it in to 21.9 or whatever that or 2.3 to 1 or whatever? I can't 3.5.
No, I think you're right. 21.9.
I think it's 21.9 or 2.35 to 1. I can't remember which. Why would you do that? Because then that restricts your field of view and just makes gameplay harder. It makes the shooting more difficult. Right? It's one thing if you're doing in cutscenes, but if you do that all the time, it makes it seem like your game is one giant cutscene, which this game kind of is. And also, maybe, again, it's hard to make a value argument, but this is a $60 game. And it does not have multiplayer. So Call of Duty, you get a 6-hour story, and then you get this world-class multiplayer. And some people don't even play the story. They're just playing the multiplayer. And it's not good value for me or Sydney, because all we do is play the story. And so, buy it used 2 years later. It's a great way to play Call of Duty. Or wait till...
And I'd say the same is true of this game, because, I mean, I'm not going to say it was a bad game. It just was not a, amazing game. It was totally functional, but... I was thinking after I finished it and was kind of wondering what I didn't like about it as much. So The Last of Us is a very similar kind of dynamic in that you're kind of going through and exploring areas that there could be zombies.
Yeah.
And it lets you do that with very minimal cutscenes. And so if you'd taken that idea from The Last of Us, as far as how they did their kind of directed open world game, and you applied it to Order 1886, it would be amazing. It would be a great great story and a great video game instead of just a great story.
Right, because again, that's relying on what video games can do well. I think Gone Home also does this, right? You can wander around that house. There are like kind of triggered events or cutscenes, but part of what lets that be more immersive than a movie is that sense of discovery. You go around and you find these things and you start to piece it together, and there are pieces of Gone Home you may not even get to because you didn't look at the right panel in the closet, right? And so it's really leaning heavily on video games as a storytelling mechanism. Again, I am in video games mostly for narrative, unless it's like a driving game. And I even like my driving games, the vague veneer of narrative. Forza Horizons 2 is a great one, right? Original Forza Horizon, I actually think had a stronger story, though worse characters. Everyone was just a douchebag and you hated them. Just hated them. The Order has that element of pick things up, but it's so linear and so... you're walking through corridor, and you're walking through corridor, and you're walking through corridor, and there's not anything necessarily inherently wrong. Everything does not have to be an open world game, which seems to be the way gaming's going, but it doesn't. Call of Duty is a corridor shooter, and it can actually do some pretty interesting things with stories, especially the most recent entry in the series. I mean, there's just some cool story beats. And those are basically corridor shooters. Halo, in many ways, is basically a corridor shooter. Corridors with environments, but corridors. But this is just so linear and so reliant on movie tropes that it just leaves behind being a good video game.
Yeah, and because of that, I still haven't sold my copy back, but I'm in the process of working on that.
Well, you beat it. I mean, there's no replay value.
Exactly. And so I will probably sell it back tomorrow, get my $30 or whatever out of it, let someone else play it for that price, and move on with my life. Like, it was an interesting game. I mean, I know I texted you at the end of it and was like, it reminded me a lot of Dishonored. It
sure,
did.
Yeah. It was a similar time period, similar art
time
style,
period,
similar characters.
yeah.
It's very similar. And Dishonored was a great game.
Just with much better graphics processing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, again, that game looks great. But when you limit the screen that much, you're not really pushing 1080p. Like, everyone, Assassin's Creed is 900p. Yeah, so is The Order. They just make you okay with it because they put black bars rather than stretching it out the whole screen. It's just super dumb. So, kind of looking at that game, maybe play it in a year when it's like $10 used. And
yeah, so I would
it.
pay. So the Metal Gear Solid game was sold as a 4 or 5 hour kind of holdover game,
but it had some replay value. But yeah, sure. Those I think those can be roughly comparable. Sure.
I mean, I'm going to go with they're roughly comparable. So whatever you would be willing to pay for that game is what you should pay for this game.
I paid $25 for Ground Zeroes.
Yeah, so you're probably
but yeah.
You're probably right where you would want to be. $25, $30, that's a good price for it. You're going to have to wait at least a year for it to come down, but it's going to be worth it.
Sure. And on that note, we should probably get out of here. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of Techies Talking Tech tonight. If you've played The Order and have a different opinion, or if you think I'm wrong about the console market, because
you can keep it to yourself.
You can keep it to yourself, or you can email us, podcast@techstlesscall.com, facebook.com/techstlesscall, pinterest.com/techstlesscall, or at techstlesscall on the Twitters. Good night. Bummer. I was looking forward to the Order.
I know. It had so much potential. Like, especially when we saw it at E3 last year.
Yeah.
It was like, oh man, that's going to be awesome.
This is kind of like Watch Dogs to me. That was supposed to be the one too. Maybe it's going to be Uncharted 4. Maybe it's going to be Bloodborne. It won't be Bloodborne.
Yeah, I'm probably going to
for somebody.